Hello, Elevate attendees, and welcome to our second keynote address, Race to Lead, with Sean Thomas Breitfeld. Please be sure to stick around after Sean's presentation, as he will be facilitating a live chat room where you can ask any questions you might have. Now, please welcome Sean to the Elevate stage.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sean Thomas Breitfeld. I'm the co-director of the Building Movement Project, and I'm going to be talking to you about some of our research in the series we call Race to Lead, about confronting the nonprofit racial leadership gap. So to get started, I want to let you know about my organization, the Building Movement Project. We are a national organization that does research on the nonprofit sector. And we have three main project areas, so starting from the right and then moving left. We look at movement building. We look at how nonprofit organizations can be working together as partners to have bigger change in partnership with each other than they might have on their own. So that's our movement building work. We also look at how human service organizations can work together for social change, in particular by tapping the voice and power of the constituents and clients that go to those organizations for services. And then the third area is leadership, looking at how organizations can support leaders, but also create alternative leadership structures so that organizations can be more equitable, inclusive, and also effective. And so what we wanted to know in terms of the question around Race to Lead was really this question about why, as a sector, we were not seeing more leaders of color in nonprofits. And we were especially curious about why the dial had not been moving in the sector, because there had been an increasing number of training programs that were supposed to be focusing on developing the skills and capacity of people of color to be nonprofit leaders. But also just in general, there had been this live conversation in the sector for years about the importance of diversity, equity, and diversity, equity, inclusion had become sort of a catchphrase in the sector. And so we were curious as to why we were not seeing real change in organizations and real change on the ground. And so as researchers, one of the things that we did was to do a national survey. And the survey was a survey that anyone working for a nonprofit organization could fill out. And the survey asked people about their demographics. So who were they? What kinds of organizations did they work for? And that was really useful for segmenting the data. We also asked respondents about their careers. So what were their future aspirations? But we also wanted to know about what kind of supports and development had gotten them to where they were in their careers. And then the last section of the survey was about, people's perceptions, their opinions about this question of the racial leadership gap in the nonprofit sector. So that was the survey that we designed, and we had this goal to get 2,000 people to fill out this survey online. And so we lined up, about a dozen, 15 organizations to be distribution partners and help get the word out about the survey. And what happened was that we ended up doubling our goal, and over 4,000 people took the survey in 2016. Certainly, over a third got the link to the survey through the distribution partners, but I think what really happened was that the survey sort of went viral, and it took on a life of its own. And in classic snowball sample fashion, we ended up with many more people taking the survey than we originally planned, because at that time in 2016, this was before the election, there was a compelling interest in having a sort of more robust conversation in the nonprofit sector about race and leadership. And so just want to give you a sense of who took the survey, because I do think that the demographics of the sample matter. So roughly 60-40 split in terms of white respondents versus people of color. And the way we structured the race question was a little complicated and I think a little novel. So the first question that people were asked was, do you identify as white or as a person of color? And then there was also a question that everyone answered where they could select any and all racial ethnic categories. And the reason we designed the survey in that way with sort of a two-level question around race was because we didn't want to be assigning people to a POC category if they didn't actually identify with that marker. And so that was an important part of the way that we structured the survey. It also then made us more confident about distinguishing between respondents of color and white respondents. And most of the data that I'm going to show you in terms of the findings are going to break things down in that way. And so we felt like those were then more meaningful categories in terms of how the data would be disaggregated. So I'm going to get into the findings. And I just want to say, before we launched and designed the survey, we did, as researchers, we read a lot. We read academic literature, but we also talked to about 36 people in the nonprofit sector who were either already leaders themselves or worked for nonprofit search firms or were capacity builders. And we asked that same question that I showed you at the very beginning about why, as a sector, we were not moving the dial, why we were not seeing more leaders of color in the nonprofit sector, in spite of the fact that there were increasing, or there was a sense that there were more opportunities for development of the leadership of people of color. And we heard a few explanations that were interesting, provocative, and also contradictory. So one of the responses that we heard when he asked this question of why we weren't seeing more leaders from these roughly 36 people, some people thought, well, there are gaps in education or other forms of qualification, and that's what's preventing people of color from moving into top leadership roles in nonprofit organizations. Our data did not bear that out. And so, again, this is our sample of 4,000 people. There are pretty much no differences in terms of educational attainment between respondents of color and white respondents. There are some slight changes or some slight differences, but they're not significant or meaningful. And so, it's really interesting to get the data back and see that education as an explanation for why there were fewer leaders of color doesn't seem to, at least based on our sample, hold much weight or explanatory power. We also heard from people that, well, maybe people of color don't want these crazy nonprofit executive director jobs because those jobs are not sustainable. And as someone who leads an organization who is in one of those sort of often draining, non-sustainable jobs, I can attest that that is often the experience. However, our data shows that people of color who are not in executive leadership roles still do aspire to that type of role in the sector. And so this shows the two pie charts, people of color on the one side and white respondents on the other. These are only the respondents who are not already in CEO or executive director roles. We obviously wouldn't ask people who are CEOs this question of, are you willing to, or do you have the aspiration to become a nonprofit executive director? But half of people of color who were not already in those roles indicated that, yes, they did definitely or probably aspire to be top-level leaders of nonprofit organizations. And the reason we knew to ask this question was because this is a question that had been asked other times by other surveys in the nonprofit sector, particularly looking at younger people in the sector and what their aspirations were to move into leadership roles. And so, it was interesting and a little bit, it was not surprising to get this data back, but it was surprising that when we were doing focus groups with people across the country, once we got the data back initially, to sort of say, what meaning can we make from these numbers? We would show these two pie charts side by side, but we would cover the person of color and white. And we would ask in these focus groups, which group did people assume had 50% of the group indicating they definitely or probably aspired to top level leadership. And repeatedly, the assumption or the guess was that it was more likely white people who had the higher degree of aspiration. And I think that really pushes us as a sector. We need to challenge ourselves about our mental models in terms of what a leader looks like. And we have to challenge the mental models about who wants to be a nonprofit leader. Because if the underlying assumption is that certain people want to lead and other people don't, that then organizations end up making a whole set of decisions that may not be intentional about who gets support, who gets trained, who gets cultivated to be the next generation of leaders for an organization. So we really need to rethink our assumptions around who's the sort of prototypical leader of a nonprofit organization. Another thing that we tested with the survey was, as I said earlier, some perception and opinion style questions. And so these are three of those explanations. Some are a little sort of intentionally provocative, I'll admit. We wanted to see what people thought in terms of their level of agreement with a few explanations for why there are still so few people of color in nonprofit executive leadership roles. And so as you can see, the first explanation that we tested was related to executive recruiters not creating or finding a diverse pool of qualified candidates for top-level leadership positions. And so the response that we got from the people who took the survey was 80% of people of color agreed with that statement. So either strong level of agreement or somewhat agreed with the statement, compared to 67% of white respondents. And then the next one relates to predominantly white boards. And we know from data that Board Source has collected year after year that nonprofit boards of directors are overwhelmingly white. And in some cases, increasingly so, or in some cases, organizations have boards that are entirely white. And so this is a statement about what we know to be true about many nonprofit boards of directors, that they are predominantly white, but then the question being, do they also not support the leadership potential of staff of color? And so you can see the difference or the split, the racial split between respondents of color and white respondents. The last one on this chart is about this question of sort of organizational fit, which essentially is about sort of bias, right? The sense that, we're going to judge people, we're going to judge applicants based on, well, do they fit the current culture of the organization? And if they don't, then we'll keep them out of the organization, essentially. And it's generally not that explicit. But when organizational fit, and I put fit in quotations intentionally, when organizational fit is used as the criteria for hiring, oftentimes it's a container for bias to sort of run rampant. And I think the much larger racial split that you see here, with 2/3 of people of color who took the survey agreeing that that is a factor in the lack of people of color in top leadership roles compared to under half of white respondents, indicates some differing views about how much people are thinking about or aware of implicit bias and the impact that it can have on organizational decision making. We also asked people to reflect on their own career advancement and what things had positively or negatively impacted their pathways. And so, you can see from this figure that track record at work is largely a positive factor in people's advancement. So the darkest colors are indicating a positive response. The lighter colors are people saying that it had a negative impact on their career advancement. Schooling and education, roughly in the 80s in terms of it being a positive, so still largely positive. But then when we get to race and ethnicity, things start to look very different between people of color who took the survey and then white respondents. And you can see, over 1/3 of people of color felt like their race was a positive, net positive in terms of their advancement. Fully half of white respondents felt like their race was a net positive in terms of their advancement. Then 28% of people of color felt like their race had no real impact on their advancement, compared to 43% of white respondents who said the race had no impact. But then over 1/3, 35% of people of color indicated in our survey that their race had a negative impact on their career advancement, compared to 6% of white respondents. And so, we really wanted to understand more about what were people's experiences that made them have this view that their race or their gender or their sexuality or their class background were having negative impacts on their career advancement. And so the survey also collected a whole bunch of write-in responses. And so out of 4,000 people, took the survey, we also had, over 1,000 write-in responses on any of those elements of identity having impacts on people's career advancement. And so this is one of the write-in responses from a survey respondent, someone who is noticing that the way their organization is structured, that people at the top of the organizational hierarchy tend to be white, frontline staff tend to be people of color, and this person identifies as a person of color and says that they struggle to be seen as an asset, but also that the organization ends up being tone deaf to the issues facing the community that's being served. So there's real costs in terms of both the impact on workers who are being shut out of opportunity, but also organizations just getting things wrong. So that's why we need to really be paying attention to diversity and equity and inclusion. We also found, when we asked about what kind of challenges or frustrations people were experiencing on the job, so 70% roughly of both people of color and white respondents felt like their jobs were demanding. And that was a frequent challenge or frustration. So just dealing with a demanding workload was something that overwhelmingly people agreed was a factor. Inadequate salaries, it's right around the halfway point. So with 51% of people of color reporting that the inadequate salaries were a frequent challenge or frustration, and then 46% of white respondents saying the same thing. But then you see with the other measures, there starts to be a widening of the gap between people of color and white. So for instance, lack of relationship with funding sources, that gap is a little bit bigger. Lack of role models, the gap is then above over 10 percentage points. A lack of social capital and network, it's 31% compared to 21%. And then the last one being called on to represent the community. So I want to share one of the write-in responses that illustrates that piece around lack of role models. So this is another survey respondent who is reflecting on their career advancement and noticing that they've never been taken under the wing of someone in a senior position. They've never been groomed or cultivated to move into higher level leadership roles, and they're noticing that they've never had a supervisor of color. And so, that I think really reflects a lot of research that has shown that in terms of the sort of informal supports and mentorship or role models that end up happening inside of organizations, that too often what happens is that people in senior roles who are in positions to provide mentorship to more junior staff, they seek a sort of confirmation bias. So you end up mentoring people who are like you in some ways and affirm that you are, that they sort of affirm your identity. And so in organizations where senior level positions are held by white leaders, but line staff tend to be people of color, there's a gap there. And unfortunately, that gap does not get closed by voluntary sort of mentorship oftentimes, because people end up mentoring or being role models to people who they see being like themselves. And so that's part of what also needs to be really, in a very intentional and structural way, rethought in organizations. Mentorship, if it's too informal, these kinds of biases can end up being perpetuated and continued. Now, I want to acknowledge that intersectionality matters. This is not going to be a surprise to people, and identity matters. And so those two quotes that I shared with you were people who were not just people of color, but one was a transgender man, one was a Black woman, and so in terms of the sample overall, basically 3/4 of the sample self-identified as women, and 20% of the sample self-identified as LGBT. And so, not surprisingly, women often indicated more challenges and frustrations than men, and LGBT people often indicated more challenges and barriers to advancement than heterosexuals. But when we looked at the intersection of race with those other factors, we also then saw that women of color were reporting more challenges and frustrations than both white women and men of color, and that LGBT people of color were often reporting more challenges and frustrations than straight people of color. So just again, an acknowledgement that identity and intersectionality matters. And so if you're interested in the way that we disaggregated the data in a more granular way, I would encourage you to check out these other two reports one looking at women of color in particular, and the other one looking at LGBT nonprofit staff. So this data can be a little disheartening and bleak, and so I want to acknowledge that there are things that we can do as staff and leaders of organizations to make our workplaces more equitable, inclusive, and diverse. And so to start getting at some of that, what we tried to understand was questions like, does your organization pay enough attention to diversity when recruiting new staff? Does your organization pay enough attention to diversity when developing and promoting staff? And you can see how our respondents in general responded to those measures. So the high was on recruiting new staff. People felt like 2/3 of respondents overall felt like their organization was doing enough or paying enough attention to diversity in that measure. But under half of respondents felt like their organization was paying enough attention to diversity when it came to external communication strategies. But that's when we just look at the data overall. And what was interesting was that when we looked at the data broken out by whether people reported that they worked for a race or immigrant-based organization, that things looked very different from if they indicated that their organization was another kind of identity-based organization. So for instance, like a feminist or women's organization or an LGBT organization. So that's the purple bar. And then last, the yellow bar is if people said that their organization was not an identity-based organization in any way. You can see for all of the measures, people working for race or for people of color or immigrant-based organizations, that they rated their organizations more favorably on all of these measures related to, does your organization pay enough attention? Also, what was interesting was that, not surprising, but still interesting, was we asked the question about whether the leaders of your organization match the constituency being served. And so you can see race mostly or somewhat different versus race mostly or somewhat matches. And so again, not surprisingly, people working for immigrants and race-based organizations, over 80% said that their leaders of their organization matched the community being served. But then it was more around half and half for all other kinds of organizations. So it's just something to think about in terms of how the sector is diverse. And it also means that organizations can be learning from each other, because there's some organizations that are, by nature of the kind of work that they do and the constituency they're serving, have a more advanced analysis and set of practices when it comes to equity and inclusion and diversity inside of their organization. And so if you're working in a particular place and you want your organization to sort of catch up, there are probably organizations in your community that have figured some of this out. But we think as an organization that what it means to really build an equitable sector, it means we have to start addressing bias and racism, because we know that bad experiences can undermine people's aspiration. But we also want to be cautious and guard against sort of making a diversity initiative another demand on people of color to represent their community inside of the organization. It can't just be an added burden to people of color. We're already trying to grapple with how to navigate an organizational hierarchy where they don't see themselves reflected. And on top of it, we're going to say, okay, now you have to also fix every issue around race inside of the organizational culture. That's a big demand. It's a big burden to put on people, and it can't just be an added thing. If it has to really be part of people's work. And we also know that it requires real leadership from the top. And so that's why the second recommendation has to do with the culture and the responsibility of current leaders. We think leaders have to build the capacity internally for some difficult conversations. We know that it's not easy to talk about race. And we know it's really not easy to talk about racism. And so that requires some skill that leaders can develop themselves, can model, but can also find outside support to make that work. But we also think it's important for organizations to create some structural efforts that will really minimize bias. And so, I think that if, for instance, hiring decisions are being made through the same system over and over again, and your organization is not having a more diverse pool of candidates or a more diverse set of people who are making it to the end of actually being hired, but it may be more diverse in terms of the original applicants, then organizations need to start thinking, well, what are the structural changes that we should be doing to keep our biases in check, and to minimize the impact of those biases on those kinds of organizational decisions. And the last thing, we think it's really important for organizations to measure change. We have to measure disparities. We have to notice and measure those disparities, and we also have to honor small wins. And it's easier to honor those changes if you've been measuring race equity data inside of your organization. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what BNP has planned for the future. So we put out a whole bunch of reports in this Race to Lead series. The next one that's going to be coming out is going to look at the subsample of respondents who indicated they were already in the CEO or executive director role. In particular, to understand sort of what are the strategies, but also what are the burdens on leaders of color. We're also doing some deeper dives in a few specific cities because we really wanted to understand what the sort of landscape of opportunity is, particularly in cities and states where the majority of the population may be people of color. So we did a report already on California, which is a more majority people of color state. And then we're drilling down in a few cities that are majority POC cities to understand what's the landscape around opportunity in the nonprofit sector. Are those sectors more diverse as a result of the demographic? We're also going to start to re-survey this summer. So if this is your first time hearing about the Race to Lead survey, I would encourage you to join our website, sign up for our newsletter so that you can then get updated about when the new survey is going to launch. We're really excited to have a much bigger sample. We had over 4,000 in 2016. We're definitely pushing to get more than 5,000 this year. So we would encourage and invite all of you to be involved in the survey effort this summer. And then the last thing, we're building an organizational assessment. It's an experiment. It's a tool that we're trying to see if we can figure out a way at a low to no cost, help organizations start their race equity journeys. And so that's some of what we've got planned for the next few months and for the coming years. So really appreciate all of you taking the time to be at Elevate and listen to this presentation, and would encourage you to check out our website, buildingmovement.org, as well as racetolead.org to download the reports in the Race to Lead series. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, so much. That was really informative, and I personally enjoyed that presentation a lot. And I will say to the rest of you, if you are like me and would like to ask Sean some follow-up questions about the Race to Lead research, please join us in the live chat room that starts right now. Later this evening, we will be hosting a movie night, and the first 50 people who click the link will receive complimentary access to Mirrors of Privilege, a documentary directed and produced by Dr. Shakti Butler of World Trust. For those of you who attended last year's Elevate, you might remember that Dr. Butler gave a wonderful keynote address, so we are pleased to be featuring her film this year. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.